My name is Robert Chafe, and I am a playwright, actor, general arts guy who lives in St. John's, Newfoundland, and I'm the artistic director of a theatre company, Artistic Prod. I did a piece with Duo Constante, Takamore Festival a couple of years ago called What Was Needed Most, which was based upon an oral history of people who were around during Confederation. That ended up becoming about my family. Well, it's very interesting. When I started that project with the Takamore Festival, I really sought to speak to people who would have been able to vote in the referendum. So I was looking for people, and this was about 5 years ago. So I was looking for people to speak to who might have been 19 and older, who would remember having a political opinion about it. And I found some of those people who were, teenagers and older. They ended up being very, very elderly. And a lot of them didn't have a lot of recollection of the time. I purposely steered away from speaking to my parents because they were so young. My dad was born in 39, so he was 10. And I thought they wouldn't have much memory of Confederation. But as I started just kind of casually talking to Dad, Dad, every time I visit him, he's like, well, what are you working on now? And so I was casually talking to him about this. And he just started talking about it, his memories of being a kid, and it switched my research on that project. I actually started actively searching out people who were children, and I found that their memories of that time were actually really sharp, probably because they weren't as elderly, they weren't as on in years as some of the other people, but also because their take on it was an adult looking back at the innocence of the time. So they had a lot of stories about kitchen table fights and opinions around the town, that they didn't understand as a kid, but came to realize later as they grew up, memories of that time from when they were kids. So it was a really interesting research period for sure. Well, I think I grew up, as I said, I was born in 71. I grew up, I think, at a period in my young adult years, and certainly young adult years merging as an artist into this arts community. I grew up with a bit of a nationalist streak, a Newfoundland nationalist streak in me. Not necessarily that I was anti-Confederation, but I had a lot of questions around it. I had a lot of mild, I wasn't waking up in the night in a sweat or anything, but I had a lot of kind of mild anger around it. I was growing into an awareness of other places in the world like Iceland that had a different trajectory than ours. I had a growing respect for countries like Iceland, and I was thinking a lot as I was becoming part of the cultural scene here, what our cultural scene might look like if we had remained a country. So a lot of those questions were circling in my head, and I have to admit, when I came to that project, I came in with a little bit of a bias. I came in with a little bit of a hope, although I probably wouldn't have articulated it that way, but I came in with a little bit of a hope that that bias would be confirmed, and that some of the folks I'd speak to would talk about a country lost. But what I actually found, darn it, what I actually found when I was speaking to those people, particularly people outside the city of St. John's, which I think is well known and well documented, what I found was that there was extreme poverty. Like what those memories circled was extreme poverty. And those people they all had a story about the first baby bonus check. These are people that remember when they were 9, 10 years old what the first baby bonus check was spent on. I had a woman who told me this incredible story about that ended up making it to the show about these boots that were passed down to the family because they were so poor, and she was allergic to these boots, and her feet would always be sore and cracked and sore. And her parents, I think they were in Twillingate, and her parents went down to the large centre, maybe Gander, and bought a pair of fur-lined boots for her. And she remembers that, like at 70, 80 years old, she remembers that her dad took that first check and went and bought that. That to me was incredible. I wasn't expecting that there would be such detailed memories of the immediate impact of the financial repercussions to some of these families in rural settings of what Confederation would have meant to them. I wasn't unhappy to find that out. Like I say, it was a mild bias. The show itself, once I discovered those stories, and once I discovered that some of those memories of people who were kids at the time were so rich, actually led me down the road of real... I added my parents to the research list, which they weren't part of originally. And I sat down for the first time in my adult life and asked my parents about their upbringing and discovered fascinating things. fascinating things, like I discovered that my mom's family, my mom is from Carpoon. I discovered that my mom's family was actually considering, relatively speaking, relatively well off. Her father worked for the government in outfitting ships going to the Labrador, so he had a government job, pension, all that kind of stuff. And they were actually, mom never wore, for example, growing up, never wore hand-me-downs. She always had new clothes they ordered from Sears catalog. That would not have been what I predicted based upon being in that community and knowing mom's upbringing. And I found that my dad was actually desperately poor, like even more poor than I would have thought. That they had a history of being on the dole, which dad still carries a weird shame about. And yeah, so those stories were really incredible, and they ended up forming the backbone of that piece. The piece itself became perhaps less about Confederation and more about those conversations leading to a discovery of my own personal history and the loosening of that bias, that young angry artist in his 20s who had all sorts of opinions, 30 or 40 years out from Confederation about what was lost, perhaps softening my opinion a little bit and coming to realize that many of the people who lived here at the time when that vote happened were in very desperate need. There's no denying that, they were. But my memory is that a couple of those people I interviewed had opinions on the role of the church in terms of Confederation, that the Catholic Church in particular were really pushing for independence. And that rubbed the people I spoke to the wrong way in many instances because of the role of the church in their communities and the money and the control that the church had in those communities versus the people that were actually living in those communities and saw Confederation as being a positive thing. That's my memory 5 years out. I don't necessarily remember speaking to someone in St. John's who upturned paradigm on those conversations too much, or vice versa, someone in rural Newfoundland actively defending independence. Yeah, it was pretty much down the lines that we've come to expect, that the urban were all for independence and really mourned the loss of the country, and that the outliers in the rural settlements were really happy to see it come, benefited greatly from it. People talked about it saving their lives. Like it was, I'm not kidding. Like there was some very emotional interviews I did where people actually talked about starving. They were on the verge of starvation. The Confederation saved their lives. That kind of language I'd never heard before, and that was really it was hard to sit through those conversations and come out with my little mild biased